Welcome to Creative Cat Productions. So you may have heard the recent news that the CEO of both Sega of America and Sega of Europe, the dapper Shuji Utsumi, has shut down any and all hopes for a future Sega Saturn or Sega Dreamcast Mini. In an interview with Keith Stewart at The Guardian on December 20th, Utsumi made a lot of interesting comments about the future of Sega and how he plans to steer the company back towards being the kind of creative game maker it used to be during the Dreamcast era, taking bold risks and looking forward rather than backward. It was in this context that Utsumi was asked about Sega's plans for their next mini console. So then he dropped a bomb saying, quote, "I am not going for the mini direction. It's not me. I want to embrace modern games. We, Sega, are not a retro company. We really appreciate our legacy, we value it, but at the same time we want to deliver something new, otherwise we'll become history. I fear a great disturbance in the force, as if millions of retro gamers suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced." This is big news, because for years now, hardcore Sega fans have been chomping at the bits in anticipation of Sega's next retro mini console. Was it going to be a Master System Mini, a Saturn Mini, a Dreamcast Mini? Well, now we know. It's going to be nada, niente, zilch. It ain't going to happen, man. And this is coming hot on the heels of Sega pulling 60 of their classic games off of Steam, Xbox, PlayStation, and the Nintendo Switch Online store. When Utsumi says he doesn't want Sega looking to the past, boy, he really seems to mean it. Late in 2023, Sega announced the Power Surge, an initiative to revive and modernize classic Sega franchises that have been dormant for decades. Shinobi, Jet Set Radio, Crazy Taxi, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage. The aim seems to be for Sega to do something proactive and new with their old game titles, as opposed to offering more tired re-releases of the same Sega Genesis games. After all, over the last 20 years, how many times has Sega done just that? There was the Sega Genesis Collection in 2006, Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection in 2009, the Sega Genesis Classics Collection in 2010, the Sega MegaDrive Collection on the Nintendo Switch, the Sega Genesis Mini in 2019, the Sega Genesis Mini in 2022, and of course there were all the lousy at-game Sega Genesis plug-and-play consoles. And then there was also the Sega Ages line, which offered a choice selection of remastered Sega Genesis games alongside numerous arcade and Master System titles. The point is, when it comes to retro games, especially for the Sega Mega Drive and the Genesis, Sega has been kind of stuck in a rut. They've become a one-trick pony, if you will. That's supposed to be a horse. And while Sonic the Hedgehog and Yakuza have more or less been allowed to flourish and go in all these new directions, many of Sega's best IPs have long remained dead and buried, only ever emerging as part of their historic legacy, a mere memory of better times, when Sega was still an actual big-time contender in the video game world. I'm sure Shuji Utsumi is painfully aware of the irony that one of the most successful Sega games in the last 10 years was a sequel to a Sega Genesis game that was made entirely by a third-party French studio. After seeing that happen, after knowing Sega executives allowed it to happen, it's probably kind of embarrassing. After all, shouldn't Sega be the ones steering the creation of all the next big Sega projects? And shouldn't Sega themselves have recognized that there was a market for this sort of thing roughly 30 years ago? That seems to be what's happening now, almost 5 years after the release of Streets of Rage 4 by a foreign independent studio. Sega, under the leadership of Shuji Utsumi, is seeking to finally capitalize on its long dormant potential. Too little too late? Maybe. But it's worth a shot. But why no more mini consoles? I've seen people admonish this notion like Utsumi's making the biggest mistake of his career. Like this is his Bernie Stoller moment. For his part, Utsumi claims that the mini consoles aren't forward-thinking. They're not his style. But I think the real reason is that the mini consoles themselves weren't profitable enough for Sega, and that the sales of the Sega Genesis Mini, both 1 and 2, were disappointing. Unlike the scarce and super hyped up NES and SNES mini consoles, the Genesis mini consoles were available in abundance long after their release, and soon they were obtainable at discount prices for many months on end. The Sega Genesis Mini 2, quite frankly, was never going to be a hit, because with all the extra memory required to store those Sega CD games, it wound up costing around $130, including taxes and the shipping costs from Japan. And any future mini consoles, unless it was based on the Master System, was going to end up costing much more, and for the exact same reason. But there's another practical reason Sega has decided to dump mini consoles, and that's because they're currently trying to develop a more profitable alternative. On the very same day that The Guardian reported on Shuji Utsumi's poignant declaration of Sega's newly forward-focused future, the BBC reported, well, kind of the opposite, revealing that Shuji Utsumi and Sega Sammy are actively discussing plans to erect what the BBC describes as a Netflix-like subscription gaming service. If such a thing were to be created, then it's a safe bet that it would be stocked with all of the retro splendor anyone could possibly want from either a Sega Saturn or a Sega Dreamcast Mini, or even a Master System Mini for that matter. This probably explains why Sega has pulled 60 of their games from all of these different online stores. Sega is planning something, and they don't want to end up competing with themselves across all of these various platforms. The same would be true for a mini console. If Sega wants to erect an online gaming service, then they need to ensure that the service has exclusive rights and access to all the best games for their rich history. And making more mini consoles would be contrary to that goal. This partly explains why Nintendo has never, and never will, put out an N64 Mini or a GameCube Mini. Not only would these devices cost too much to sell, but their existence would negatively impact the appeal of Nintendo's own online retro gaming service. Oddly enough, one place Sega has yet to pull out of is with the Nintendo Switch online subscription service, which currently hosts an impressive assortment of 48 different Sega MegaDrive games. Obviously, Sega and Nintendo have some kind of binding agreement here, but I wouldn't be surprised to see the Sega Genesis lineup disappear from Switch Online entirely in the future, unless of course Sega intends to go all in with Nintendo and make their future online game catalog a Nintendo exclusive. Getting on board with a single entity like Nintendo would immediately solve a lot of logistical problems for such a plan. Compatibility issues, hardware issues, infrastructure problems like online hosting could all be solved by simply piggybacking onto a pre-existing established service. So then why not Nintendo? It's just a thought. So yes, sadly, we're never going to see an overpriced Sega Saturn Mini or a Dreamcast Mini. But we shouldn't be too quick to believe Shuji Utsumi's declaration that Sega's past isn't part of its future. After all, that's what the Sega Power Surge was all about. That's why everyone's so excited about a new Virtual Fighter game. And that's why Sega is actively trying to break into the subscription gaming service space. Because they know darn well that their future is inescapably bound up with their past, and unless they get better at capitalizing on that past, today, then their future isn't likely to be all that promising. So what do you think of Shuji Utsumi's bold declaration that mini consoles aren't the future of Sega? Would you sign up for a Sega subscription service if it granted you access to a robust Saturn and Dreamcast library? I know I would, just to play Skies of Arcadia alone. Let us know what you think and more in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Later, dudes! Bye-bye now.